Welcome to Sinister Truths, the channel where history's darkest secrets, the ones most people wish were forgotten, are finally unearthed. Today, we're diving into a story so chilling it feels almost unreal. Yet every detail comes from the murky records of Louisiana in 1843. Imagine a grand plantation on the edge of a silent, fog-filled bayou, the kind of place where sunlight seems to vanish before it touches the ground. Here lived a woman whose beauty and charm masked something horrifying. A woman whose obsession with control turned her into a nightmare for those bound to her by chains. Before we begin, take a moment and comment below. Which country are you watching from, and what time of day is it there? Morning, midnight, or somewhere in between? We read every comment. And if you're drawn to the darkest stories history tried to bury, make sure to subscribe. This is Sinister Truths, and we promise to guide you through every secret, every shadow. Madame Eveline Duval was the kind of woman who seemed to emerge from a painter's darkest masterpiece. Her skin was pale, almost luminous, as if untouched by the Louisiana sun, and yet her eyes held a sharpness, a glint that made those who met her glance away quickly, feeling inexplicably unsettled. She carried herself with the precision of someone who had studied every gesture, every movement, until it was perfect. Every tilt of the head, every soft laugh, every flicker of her lashes seemed carefully calculated. She smiled, and her smile could warm a room. But behind that warmth, there was a coldness, a sense of control that few could sense at first glance. Those who observed her, even from a distance, felt a subtle shiver, as if a shadow had passed over the sunlit lawn. Her journey to the Duval plantation had been the subject of much gossip in New Orleans. Stories of her beauty and sophistication had preceded her. Guests at her wedding ball spoke of the soft glimmer of her pearls, the delicate lace that adorned her sleeves, the way the silk of her gown seemed to float in the humid southern air like a wisp of smoke. Some said she could command attention without speaking a single word. Others whispered that her charm was almost hypnotic, drawing people in, only to leave them uneasy once they were close. But while all admired her beauty, few dared to linger too long in her presence, sensing, perhaps instinctively, that behind that porcelain mask was something darker than anyone dared to imagine. When she arrived at the Duval plantation, it was not with the shy awe of a young bride, but with the assuredness of someone who had already claimed her place in the world. The plantation itself was vast, stretching for miles along the edge of the murky bayou. Spanish moss hung like gray curtains from the cypress trees, and the humid air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and stagnant water. Large columns framed the entrance of the main house, gleaming white against the rich green of the surrounding land. Seascape. Flowers bloomed in carefully tended gardens, their fragrances blending with the musky smell of the swamp, creating an atmosphere that was at once beautiful and subtly oppressive. Eveline's arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter in the estate's history. Her husband, Monsieur Henri Duval, a man of considerable wealth and influence, had been a respected figure in the region. He was known for his business acumen, his commanding presence, and his ability to maintain order among the many workers who tended the plantation. Yet, in Eveline's presence, even Henri seemed slightly diminished. She had a way of observing people as if she could see into the very depths of their thoughts, their fears, and their desires. This was not the kind of attention that inspired comfort. It was the kind that made one feel exposed, vulnerable, and strangely powerless. It was immediately apparent that Eveline had her own ideas about how things should be run. She walked through the plantation grounds with a careful eye, noting the alignment of the hedges, the cleanliness of the paths, and the demeanor of the workers. While she appeared polite and refined in front of guests, there was a sharpness in her gaze, a way of assessing and judging that left those who crossed her feeling anxious. Even the most loyal staff found themselves wondering if their next misstep might draw her scrutiny, or worse, her wrath. But what truly set Eveline apart from other women of her social standing was her obsession with control. She did not merely wish to manage her household, she wanted to dominate it completely. Every movement of the workers, every whisper among the servants, every step across the polished floors was a test, a measurement of obedience and submission. Those who pleased her found themselves rewarded with small, almost imperceptible gestures of approval, a nod, a smile, a polite word of thanks. But those who faltered, even slightly, were soon reminded of their place in ways that were far more subtle and terrifying than any visible punishment. It did not take long for whispers of Eveline's unusual demeanor to circulate among the staff. She seemed fascinated by the swamp that bordered the plantation. the dark, twisting waters that snaked through the cypress trees and vanished into the foggy horizon. The swamp was dangerous, filled with hidden sinkholes, venomous snakes and alligators that moved silently beneath the surface, yet Eveline would walk its edges with an almost magnetic interest, sometimes standing for hours, staring into the black waters as if communicating with some unseen presence. Workers began to feel uneasy when she wandered near the swamp alone, sensing that her fascination was not innocent curiosity but something far more sinister. On her first evening at the plantation, Eveline hosted a small gathering. Candles flickered against the walls of the grand hall, casting long shadows that seemed to dance alongside the guests. Wine flowed, and music filled the air with soft, lilting melodies, yet there was a tension underlying the celebration, subtle but unmistakable. Servants moved quietly, anticipating her needs, while she observed them as though each action were a puzzle to solve. And while the guests admired her charm, those who looked closely could see a faint, almost imperceptible smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes, one that hinted at something hidden and deeply unsettling. As the days passed, Eveline's presence began to cast a long shadow over the plantation. Workers whispered in corners, sharing stories of her strange behaviors, the way she would appear silently behind someone, the way she seemed to anticipate the smallest mistakes, the way she occasionally disappeared near the swamp, only to return with a serene expression as if nothing had occurred. No one knew what she did during these moments, but a palpable fear began to grow. People spoke in hushed tones of the bride's shadow, a term that captured both her elegance and the creeping dread she inspired. Eveline's relationship with her husband was equally enigmatic. Henri Duval admired her, but he was increasingly aware that her mind was unlike any other he had encountered. She questioned decisions with a quiet intensity, suggested changes with a pointed precision, and carried an air of authority that subtly undermined his own. Friends who visited the plantation remarked on her influence, noting that even Henri seemed to defer to her judgment on matters both trivial and significant. And yet, for all her control, Eveline maintained the appearance of grace and humility, a duality that made her both fascinating and frightening. The local community soon began to notice that things were changing at the Duval estate. Guests who visited reported an eerie calm, a sense that the plantation was alive with silent observation. The enslaved workers became more withdrawn, their conversations clipped, their eyes constantly flicking toward Eveline, as if searching for a sign of her displeasure. Stories circulated of people who had angered her in small ways, misplacing an item, speaking out of turn, failing to complete a task promptly, only to vanish for hours, returning pale and shaken, or not returning at all. Eveline's obsession with perfection extended beyond behavior into the very environment of the plantation. Gardens were rearranged according to her exact specifications, rooms were cleaned and polished with meticulous care, even the staff's attire was scrutinized, corrected, and, if necessary, replaced. There was a rhythm to her control, a methodical precision that left no room for error. And in the midst of all this, the swamp remained her silent companion, a dark and mysterious entity that seemed to absorb her attention, almost as if it were a living extension of her will. By the end of her first year at the Duval plantation, it became evident that Eveline Duval was unlike any woman the region had known. She possessed an intelligence that was sharp, a beauty that was captivating, and a darkness that was undeniable. Workers, neighbors, and even her husband could sense it. She was a force to be reckoned with, a presence that could not be ignored, and a woman whose influence extended far beyond the walls of her home. Yet beneath the surface of her elegance and sophistication, there was a stirring of something more profound, something that would define her legacy in the years to come. It was not enough for Eveline to simply command attention or inspire fear. She sought complete dominance, a mastery over both people and place. And as the fog of the bayou rolled over the plantation each night, concealing the twisted roots and hidden waters, it seemed to whisper to her, offering secrets that only she could hear, promising power in ways that no one else could imagine. In the quiet of the southern evenings, as cicadas sang and the swamp exhaled its damp, earthy scent, Eveline Duval walked the edges of her domain, her gaze fixed on the dark waters. The grandeur of her home, the elegance of her appearance, the fear she inspired, all were part of a careful tapestry she was weaving, one that would soon envelop everyone on the plantation. Her story was only beginning, and the shadows she cast were already long, stretching over every path, every tree and every trembling soul who dared cross her. By now it was clear. The Louisiana bride was no ordinary woman, and the Duval plantation was no ordinary estate. Something dark had taken root here, something that would grow in silence, in secrecy, and in terror. And for those who worked and lived there, it was only a matter of time before the true extent of Eveline's power, and her obsession with the swamp would reveal itself in ways that would haunt the Bayou for generations. The days following Eveline Duval's arrival at the Duval plantation were filled with an uneasy rhythm, a pulse that seemed to echo through the grand hallways, across the polished floors, and into the dense, shadowy edges of the surrounding swamp. It was a rhythm that no one could name, yet everyone felt it, a quiet, omnipresent tension that wrapped the estate in a cloak of silent dread. The workers moved with careful precision, anticipating Eveline's gaze before it fell upon them, their steps deliberate and hushed. Even the birds in the cypress trees seemed to fall silent when she walked past, as if nature itself acknowledged the weight of her presence. The swamp, a sprawling labyrinth of dark water and twisted roots, had always been a place of caution and superstition for the locals. It was said that the waters held secrets older than the towns themselves, that the fog that rolled across the bayou at dawn and dusk could hide anything from a wandering traveler to the most cunning predator. But Eveline's fascination with this place went beyond the normal curiosity of a landowner. She walked its edges for hours, her gaze penetrating the shadows, her movements deliberate, as though she were both studying and communing with the swamp itself. To the enslaved workers, the swamp became a place of fear and whispered legend. It was here that Eveline's cruelty first revealed itself in ways too subtle for outsiders to detect but impossible to ignore for those who lived under her watch. Servants who faltered, whether by misplacing an item, speaking out of turn, or simply appearing too slow in her estimation, were quietly led to the swamp. No one ever heard what happened there. Some returned, pale and shaken, their eyes hollow with terror, while others vanished completely, swallowed by the dark waters and thick, tangled roots. The plantation staff spoke in hushed voices about the bride's bayou, a place where the mist was heavy and the air seemed to thrum with secrets too terrible to name. The first known disappearance occurred less than a month after Eveline's arrival. A young man named Jacques, strong and hard-working, had accidentally dropped a basket of fruit while carrying it to the kitchen. Eveline's eyes narrowed as she observed the mishap from the veranda, her hands clasped delicately in front of her. She did not shout, nor did she raise her voice. Instead, she simply nodded slightly toward the swamp. That evening, Jacques was sent on an errand that led him along the swamp's edge, and by nightfall, he was gone. Some claimed they heard faint cries in the fog, but when other workers went to investigate, there was nothing. Only the cold, still water, swallowing every sound and reflection. After Jacques' disappearance, unease settled over the plantation like a thick, suffocating blanket. Workers began to avoid Eveline's gaze, speaking only when necessary and performing their tasks with rigid precision. Children, too young to understand the full weight of her power, felt it instinctively, recoiling at her approach, sensing the danger in the elegant tilt of her head, the measured cadence of her steps, and the faint, chilling smile that seemed to linger at the corners of her lips. Eveline, however, was not content with mere obedience. She sought control over fear itself. She understood that terror was more effective when it was subtle, when it crept into the mind and settled there like a shadow that refused to lift. She would often appear suddenly near the swamp, standing motionless as if waiting for someone, her presence alone enough to send shivers down the spines of those who dared approach. Workers reported seeing her in the pre-dawn mist, her reflection barely visible in the dark waters, and later swore that her figure seemed to move with the fog itself, gliding silently across the swamp as if she were part of it. The swamp became a tool, a weapon in Eveline's carefully orchestrated reign. She learned its hidden paths, its treacherous undercurrents, the places where the mud sucked at one's feet and the roots threatened to twist an ankle into a fatal trap. She studied the alligators, the snakes, and the tangled cypress knees, understanding how each could serve her purposes, how the natural dangers of the swamp could amplify the terror she inspired. To the outside world, the Duval estate appeared prosperous and orderly, but beneath the surface, the plantation was a place where fear and death moved silently, guided by Eveline's hand. Over time, the stories of the swamp's horrors began to circulate beyond the plantation. Travelers on nearby roads reported hearing cries in the fog, glimpses of a pale figure standing at the water's edge, and the faint sound of laughter that did not belong to any ordinary person. Local children dared each other to approach the swamp, only to flee screaming when the mist seemed to reach out with ghostly hands. Even the neighboring plantation owners spoke in quiet tones of the Bayou bride, a woman whose beauty and elegance were rivaled only by the terror she inspired. Eveline's methods were meticulous. She kept detailed accounts of who had displeased her and in what manner, noting small infractions that might have gone unnoticed in any other household. The swamp became her private stage, where obedience was tested and punishment administered without witnesses, without explanation. There was a rhythm to her cruelty, a deliberate pacing that ensured fear took root and grew, feeding on itself, until even those who survived her initial tests felt the constant weight of her scrutiny. One evening, a particularly brave group of workers attempted to challenge Eveline's authority, thinking they might resist her subtle manipulations. They spoke in whispers, forming a plan to avoid her gaze and complete their tasks without drawing her attention. But Eveline, as always, anticipated their movements. She appeared suddenly at the edge of the swamp, her presence silent but overwhelming, her eyes scanning the group with unerring precision. One by one, the workers were taken along the swamp's perimeter, leaving the others frozen in fear. That night, the swamp seemed to swallow more than just bodies. It absorbed hope, courage, and any sense of security that remained within the plantation's walls. Even the animals on the estate seemed to sense the shift in the air. Horses grew skittish when Eveline approached, dogs cowered in corners, and birds fell silent as if acknowledging the dark energy she carried. The house itself seemed alive, creaking and groaning under the weight of unseen tension, responding to her moods and movements in ways that made the staff feel as though the entire estate were complicit in her designs. Eveline's fascination with the swamp extended beyond punishment. She collected specimens, odd plants, insects, and occasionally the remains of creatures that had fallen victim to the water's hidden traps. She examined them with a clinical precision, as though studying the mechanics of death itself, finding in the natural world a reflection of the control she sought over her human subjects. The swamp became both her laboratory and her canvas, a place where she could craft terror in forms both subtle and absolute. Rumors among the staff began to intertwine with superstition. Some claimed Eveline had made pacts with forces unseen, that her beauty and poise were maintained by dark means, and that the swamp itself was alive with her will. Others whispered of midnight rituals, of figures glimpsed in the fog, and of faint laughter carried across the water in the dead of night. Whether these stories were true or born of fear, they reinforced the psychological grip Eveline held over everyone on the estate. Despite the growing fear, Eveline maintained a public persona of elegance and refinement. She entertained guests, hosted luncheons, and participated in social events in New Orleans, all the while ensuring that no one outside the plantation ever suspected the horrors she orchestrated in private. To the outside world, she was the perfect bride, a symbol of grace, beauty, and intelligence. But for those who lived under her roof, the swamp was a constant reminder of her power, a dark mirror reflecting the extent of her control. As the months turned into years, the plantation became a place of quiet terror. The swamp, once merely a natural boundary, had been transformed into a realm of dread, where the slightest misstep could result in disappearance. Workers moved like shadows, speaking only when necessary, their eyes flicking constantly toward Eveline, and then toward the dark water that seemed to watch them back. It was as if the very land had become an extension of her will, and the natural world itself had joined in her silent reign of fear. Yet Eveline's obsession was not solely about punishment. It was about dominance, the absolute mastery of those around her, and the environment she commanded. Every tree, every root, every ripple in the swamp was catalogued in her mind, every infraction memorized, every fear cultivated. She understood that true power lay not just in physical control but in shaping the psyche, instilling a pervasive sense of helplessness, and ensuring that even the bravest souls questioned their own judgment and sanity. By the time the Duval plantation had fully adapted to Eveline's presence, it had become something far beyond a home. It was a fortress of fear, a living organism in which she was the heart, the mind, and the shadow that extended into every corner. The swamp, once silent and mysterious, now hummed with her influence, a dark partner in her orchestration of terror. And for those who dared to cross her, whether intentionally or by accident, There was no escaping the reality that Eveline Duval, the Louisiana bride, had claimed both the land and the people as her own. Even neighbors, curious travelers, and passing traders could sense something was amiss. The estate exuded a strange stillness, an unnatural calm that contrasted sharply with the wild energy of the surrounding bayou. Few ventured close, and fewer returned. Ned with more than vague impressions of unease. Inside the plantation, whispers of the swamp's embrace grew louder, tales of missing workers, pale faces, and a bride who walked with the fog became common, though none dared speak openly in her presence. Fear had become a living, breathing force, guided by Eveline's careful hand, extending even beyond the boundaries of the Duval estate. And so, the plantation thrived in silence, productivity maintained not through kindness or respect, but through the unyielding weight of terror, orchestrated by a woman whose beauty and poise were matched only by the depths of her cruelty. The swamp, patient and eternal, absorbed every secret, every scream, every disappearance, becoming a silent witness to the unfolding nightmare. In Eveline Duval's world there was no escape, no reprieve, only the relentless, creeping presence of a power that was both elegant and horrifying, a power rooted in fear, nurtured in silence, and reflected endlessly in the dark waters of the Bayou plantation, had grown quiet in a way that was unnatural, a silence that pressed on every soul like a physical weight. By the second year of Eveline Duval's residence, the workers had adapted to her rules, or at least they tried to. They walked with measured steps, voices hushed, eyes constantly flicking toward the dark silhouette of the swamp. The morning mist rolled in over the bayou with an almost sentient awareness, curling around the cypress knees like ghostly fingers, whispering tales of dread to those who dared listen. The swamp was no longer just a natural boundary. It had become a stage for Eveline's mastery of fear, a labyrinth where the slightest misstep could vanish a person entirely. It was during the early months of spring that the first notable disappearance occurred. The evening had begun like any other, with the workers performing their routine tasks, chopping wood, tending the gardens, carrying supplies to the kitchens. The sun dipped low, painting the plantation in muted golds and shadows, and the air smelled damp, heavy with the promise of approaching rain. A young maid named Elise, barely 16, had been tasked with fetching water from the bayou's edge. She knew better than to linger, yet curiosity, or perhaps an instinctive unease, compelled her to glance at the water, shimmering faintly under the dying light. It was then she saw Eveline standing there, her reflection fractured in the rippling water, her pale face serene, almost ethereal. Eveline's presence near the swamp was never casual. The workers had learned to note her movements with a mixture of fear and fascination. On this evening, she gestured subtly with a gloved hand toward Elise, an almost imperceptible beckoning. The girl froze, heart hammering, and instinctively began to retreat, but her hesitation was enough. That night, Elise vanished. The following morning, the other servants searched desperately, calling her name into the fog, their voices loud by the swamp. They found nothing, only the cold, dark water and the eerie silence that now defined the estate. The disappearances became more frequent, each one escalating the tension among the staff. Workers who might once have hesitated to approach Eveline now moved with the precision of shadows, anticipating her gaze, their every action designed to avoid the slightest misstep. Yet no amount of caution seemed sufficient. Some were taken alone, others in pairs, always near the swamp's edge, always leaving behind only whispers and rumors. Those who witnessed a colleague being taken were left with an overwhelming sense of dread, their memories of the event forming into silent warnings. Do not draw her attention, do not falter. One of the most harrowing accounts came from a young man named Lucien, a strong and capable worker who had been with the Duval plantation for several years. Lucien was intelligent, observant, and courageous, perhaps too courageous in Eveline's estimation. He had noticed subtle patterns in her behavior, movements that suggested she observed the swamp not merely as a natural feature, but as an instrument of control. He had seen her standing motionless for hours, her eyes tracing invisible lines across the water, fingers occasionally flicking as if to adjust something unseen. Lucien had even speculated to a trusted colleague that Eveline might be studying the workers, testing them, learning their fears, and then using the swamp to exploit them. One late evening, Lucien and a few others attempted to avoid her scrutiny while performing their duties. The night was thick with fog, and the swamp appeared as a black mirror, reflecting nothing but shadows and fear. They thought themselves careful, whispering only when necessary, their movements measured. But Eveline, as always, anticipated every step. She appeared at the water's edge without a sound, her gown trailing lightly over the wet grass, and her eyes swept across the workers with a precision that left no room for error. One by one she beckoned them closer, her gestures delicate, almost polite, yet charged with an unspoken menace. Lucien was the first to vanish. One moment he was there, his hand gripping the wooden railing of the dock, the next, he was gone, swallowed by the swamp's murky waters. The others froze, paralyzed by fear, their voices caught in their throats. They searched desperately, their lanterns casting trembling circles of light across the fog, but found nothing. No trace of Lucien, no sign of struggle, only the cold, unyielding swamp, which seemed to pulse with silent approval. That night, the remaining workers huddled together in the servants' quarters, whispering prayers and recounting the horrors they had witnessed. Each disappearance reinforced a single, terrifying truth. The Louisiana bride's control was absolute, and the swamp was her instrument. As the months progressed, fear became a language in itself, spoken through glances subtle, gestures, and careful movements. Workers learned to anticipate Eveline's moods, to note the slight tilt of her head or the faint narrowing of her eyes, for these small signals could mean life or death. The swamp had become both prison and executioner, and the absence of those who had vanished was a constant reminder of her power. The stories of these disappearances spread through the neighboring plantations in whispered conversations, tales of the Bayou bride who commanded the swamp itself and could make people vanish as if they had never existed. There were those who tried to resist, to challenge her dominance, believing that courage or cunning could save them. One group of workers, led by an older man named Henri, attempted to leave the plantation under cover of darkness. They moved carefully, avoiding Eveline's gaze, navigating the twisted paths and hidden channels that led away from the swamp. But Eveline's intuition was unmatched. She appeared silently in the fog, her reflection glimmering in the water like a phantom, and one by one, they were drawn back, some slipping into the swamp, others retreating in terror. The escape attempt failed, and the survivors were left broken, their spirits crushed under the weight of her omnipresent control. Even within the house, the atmosphere became oppressive. The servants spoke little, and their eyes darted constantly, following every movement. Footsteps on the polished floors echoed like distant warnings, reminding everyone that Eveline could appear at any moment. The children of the plantation, though largely kept away from the swamp, sensed the tension, the invisible threads of fear that bound the household together. They became quiet, watchful, and cautious, learning early that the simplest misstep could draw Eveline's attention, and attention from her was never benign. The disappearances were not only a method of control but also a demonstration of power. Eveline understood psychology in ways that were almost supernatural, using fear to manipulate, to dominate, and to inspire obedience without overt violence. Those who survived an encounter with her near the swamp carried the terror in their very bones, a silent, invisible chain that ensured compliance. Stories began to circulate of workers who were found days later, wandering near the swamp's edge, muttering incoherently, their eyes wide with unspoken horrors, forever changed by what they had seen or experienced. Eveline's methods were subtle, almost surgical. She did not strike out with brute force but with precision, ensuring that the threat was psychological as much as physical. A worker might be summoned to the swamp for a minor infraction, a dropped tool, a misaligned row of plants, and that worker might return pale and trembling, recounting only fragmented memories, or not at all. The swamp, ever patient, absorbed these acts of terror, the water and mud becoming silent accomplices in her reign. One of the most chilling accounts came from a young maid named Juliette, who had been with the Duval estate for less than a year. She had noticed the pattern of disappearances and, in desperation, confided in another servant, hoping for guidance. "I cannot stay silent," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the shadowed tree line of the swamp. "I cannot watch them take everyone and do nothing." Her friend warned her, voice trembling, that to speak was to invite attention, that Eveline's eyes saw and remembered far more than anyone could imagine. But curiosity, or perhaps a sense of moral obligation, compelled Juliette to continue watching, to try to understand. One evening, as she approached the swamp's edge to collect water, she saw Eveline standing there, serene and beautiful, yet emanating a presence so powerful it seemed to bend the mist around her. Juliet froze, heart hammering, and in that instant she understood that the disappearances were not random. They were deliberate, orchestrated, and inevitable. The psychological terror extended beyond the physical disappearances. Workers began to see Evelyn's power in the smallest details. A misaligned tool, a crooked chair, or even the faintest hesitation in a gesture could draw her gaze. Her ability to control fear was unparalleled. It seeped into every corner of the plantation, into every interaction, creating an environment where no one could feel safe, not even for a moment. Neighbors and visitors occasionally glimpsed the eerie calm of the plantation, noting how the workers moved silently, like shadows obeying some invisible command. Travelers passing the bayou at night sometimes claimed to hear muffled cries carried on the mist, or glimpsed pale figures near the water, only to find the swamp empty when they approached. These tales, half real and half imagined, cemented Evelyn's reputation beyond the plantation as a figure of dark fascination, a bride who ruled with subtle, relentless terror, her presence as inescapable as the swamp itself. By the third year, it became clear that the disappearances were an unbroken chain of control. Each act reinforced the previous, creating a network of fear so complete that the workers could no longer imagine a life beyond Evelyn's influence. They adapted to her presence, yes, but only as shadows of themselves, hollowed by dread and constantly aware of the swamp's patient, silent power. The disappearances were no longer mere events. They had become ritualized, almost ceremonial in their execution. Evelyn would observe, select, and command with deliberate precision, her actions choreographed to maximize fear, ensure obedience, and assert her dominance. Those taken by the swamp became ghostly legends, their absence a living testament to the Louisiana bride's authority, and a warning to anyone who dared to challenge her control. Even as whispers of rebellion emerged, small, tentative, and hopeless, the disappearances continued, reinforcing her unchallenged power. Workers learned to move as shadows, speaking only when necessary, their eyes always aware of Evelyn's, their thoughts always tuned to the subtle rhythms of fear she orchestrated. And the swamp, patient and eternal, remained a dark mirror, reflecting her power, absorbing the terror, and becoming an inseparable part of the legend of the Louisiana bride. By now, it was no longer simply a story of control. It was a tale of horror, subtle yet unrelenting, of lives erased without trace, of a woman who had mastered fear itself, and of a swamp that had become a silent accomplice in her reign. Those who vanished were never spoken of again, yet their presence lingered in the whispers, the shadows, and the ever-present mist that rolled silently over the bayou. The disappearances had become Evelyn Duval's signature, the dark heart of her growing legend. Her influence stretched across every corner of the plantation, beyond the immediate staff, beyond even the land itself. And as the years passed, the swamp became not just a boundary, but a kingdom of shadows, ruled by the Louisiana bride, whose beauty, intelligence, and cruelty were now inseparable from the land she had claimed, the fear she had cultivated, and the silent, terrifying power she wielded with unmatched precision. The plantation was no longer just a place of work. It had become a web of whispers, shadows, and silent calculations. Every corner, every hallway, every edge of the swamp seemed alive with anticipation, as if the land itself had absorbed Evelyn Duval's presence and carried her will through the very air. Those who had survived her calculated cruelties moved like shadows, never daring to meet her gaze for more than a fleeting second, and yet within their hushed tones there began to emerge a different kind of sound, whispers that refused to be entirely silenced. Rumors began to stir, threads of hope interwoven with fear, tales of rebellion mingling with the memory of the vanished. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the servants' quarters. The women, mostly older and wiser, would lean closer when they thought Evelyn could not see, sharing hushed stories of what had happened to those taken to the swamp. They spoke in metaphors and veiled language, but the meaning was clear: do not trust the water, do not trust her. Plan, or you too will vanish. These conversations, once fragmented and secretive, began to coalesce into something more deliberate, a network of communication that spanned the corners of the estate, from the kitchens to the stables, to the tiny cabins near the outer fields. Among the workers, a quiet determination began to form. It was fragile and easily crushed, but it existed. Some whispered of escape routes they had discovered while performing their chores. Others shared what little they knew of Eveline's routines, her obsessions, her patterns of movement near the swamp. Even the slightest knowledge, a glimpse of her shadow in the fog or a trace of her reflection in the water, became invaluable intelligence. They spoke of the swamp not only as a place of fear, but as a terrain to be navigated, mapped and understood, a deadly chessboard upon which their lives depended. One night, as the plantation lay beneath the oppressive heat and hum of the bayou, a small group gathered in the servants' quarters. Their faces were drawn, eyes wide with tension, but determination glimmered within them. Henri, a man seasoned by years on the plantation, spoke first, his voice low and steady despite the tremor of fear he could not hide. "We cannot remain shadows forever," he said, glancing toward the cracked window where the mist hovered over the swamp. "She grows stronger with every fear she instills. If we do not act, there will be no one left to remember who we were." The others listened in silence, hearts pounding, for they all knew the stakes. Eveline Duval was no ordinary mistress. Her ability to manipulate, to inspire terror, and to anticipate every movement had ensured that any rebellion had to be executed with perfect precision. One misstep, one miscalculation could mean death or disappearance, and yet, fear had reached a point where inaction was no longer an option. The swamp, which had claimed so many, had also become a source of hope. If they could learn its secrets, perhaps it could also be their path to freedom. Their plan was not simple. They could not merely flee, for Eveline's presence and knowledge of the land made it nearly impossible. They would need to move silently, avoid her gaze, and use every shadow, every tree, every bend in the swamp to their advantage. Every step would have to be calculated, every sound measured, every breath controlled. They began to practice small movements, walking near the swamp under cover of night, testing the paths, memorizing the routes, the shallow pools, the hidden sinkholes that might betray them. In these secret exercises, the swamp, once a symbol of fear, became a teacher, patient, dangerous, but offering lessons that might ensure survival. Meanwhile, Eveline continued her meticulous control, oblivious to the small currents of resistance, beginning to swirl among her workers. She observed the plantation as a conductor observes an orchestra, noting every misalignment, every hesitation, and every trace of anxiety. She walked the edges of the swamp, her pale reflection fractured in the water, and her thoughts seemed to blend with the fog, as if she were part of the mist itself. The workers who dared move too freely were subtly corrected, sometimes through whispers, sometimes through small disappearances that reinforced the terror she commanded. The rebellion, fragile as it was, existed beneath a veil of overwhelming caution, constantly tested and pruned by Eveline's relentless surveillance. Rumors of her cruelty spread beyond the plantation, reaching neighboring estates and the small towns scattered along the bayou. Travelers spoke of the Bayou bride with a mixture of fascination and horror. Tales of the disappeared workers, of eerie cries in the mist, and of Eveline's cold, calculating beauty became a local legend. These stories, though terrifying, fueled the imagination of the workers themselves, who realized that her power extended beyond mere physical threats. It was psychological, spreading fear into every heart within and outside the Duval estate. The tension among the workers reached a breaking point one particularly oppressive summer evening. The heat hung over the plantation like a wet blanket, the air thick with humidity, and the swamp exhaling its damp, earthy scent in waves. That night, a group of women and men convened near the old barn, hidden behind the shadows of the cypress trees. Their whispered voices blended with the chirping of cicadas, creating an eerie symphony of secrecy. Plans were discussed with care. Who would move first? Who would create distractions? How they would navigate the treacherous edges of the swamp? Every detail mattered. The smallest oversight could mean immediate disappearance. Among them, a young man named Armand emerged as a natural leader. He was sharp, observant, and unyielding in his determination to protect those who could not protect themselves. Armand had seen too many vanishings, friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances who had drawn Eveline's attention. He spoke softly but firmly, outlining a plan that relied not only on stealth but on knowledge of the swamp, understanding of Eveline's routines, and the careful cultivation of courage among the group. "She may see everything," he said, "but she cannot control what we do when we move as one, when we trust each other." The plan was dangerous, almost unimaginable in its complexity. They would not flee immediately, that would be noticed. Instead, they began to practice small acts of defiance. Subtle gestures, misaligned tools, minor delays in their work, all calculated to test Eveline's reactions. Each act of subtle rebellion was a dangerous risk, a test of nerves and cunning. When one worker nearly drew her attention, the others remained motionless, frozen in shadows, hearts hammering, breath caught. Eveline's eyes scanned the area with unerring precision, yet she appeared to sense not only the action but the intention, as if she could read the unspoken thoughts of every person on the estate. Despite the danger, a strange sense of unity began to form among the workers. Fear, which had once isolated them, now became a bond. They shared whispered messages, coded through glances, gestures, and subtle signals. Every misstep or disappearance they witnessed reinforced the stakes, yet also strengthened their resolve. They understood that Eveline's power, formidable as it was, had limits that could be tested, perhaps even exploited. The swamp, a place of terror, also offered opportunities. Hidden paths, shallow channels, and the dense fog became tools, allies in a dangerous game that required every ounce of courage and cunning they possessed. The first major attempt at rebellion came on a moonless night, when the mist hung low over the water and the plantation seemed suspended in a quiet, tense anticipation. A group of 10 workers, led by Armand, moved silently toward the swamp, guided by knowledge gained through months of careful observation. They avoided Eveline's line of sight, moving like shadows, their breaths slow, their hearts synchronized in fearful rhythm. The swamp loomed ahead, black and endless, its waters swallowing sound and reflection alike. Every step was a test, every movement a gamble with death, but Eveline, ever vigilant, had anticipated such attempts. Her presence near the swamp that night was subtle but undeniable. She stood at the water's edge, pale and composed, her figure reflected in the dark surface, motionless yet radiating authority. The workers froze at the sight, hearts pounding, knowing instinctively that any sudden movement could betray them. Eveline's eyes swept over them, not with anger, but with something colder: assessment, calculation, the satisfaction of one who understands fear as both tool and companion. The workers hesitated, caught between survival and the desperate desire for freedom. And in that instant, the swamp itself seemed to respond. Mist thickened, curling around the roots and edges, obscuring paths, hiding treacherous mud pits and tangled vegetation. It became clear that the swamp, patient and eternal, had become an extension of Eveline's will, a partner in her orchestration of terror. Those who survived this night would carry its memory forever, the experience etched into their minds as both a lesson and a warning. Rumors of these attempts began to spread among the remaining workers, increasing both fear and determination. They realized that rebellion was possible, but only with precision, patience, and unity. Eveline's omnipresent observation, combined with the swamp's dangers, meant that each act of defiance required a delicate balance between courage and strategy. Every whisper, every glance, every hidden gesture became part of a larger plan, a complex dance of shadows and survival. By now, Eveline's reputation had transcended the boundaries of the plantation. Stories of her cruelty, her beauty, and her command over the swamp circulated in neighboring towns and plantations. Travelers spoke of her as a figure of dark fascination, the Louisiana bride whose elegance masked unspeakable cruelty, whose presence inspired both awe and terror. These tales reached the ears of the workers, reinforcing both their fear and their resolve, creating a paradoxical motivation to resist the power that seemed invincible, yet human in its obsession. The months that followed were a delicate balance of rebellion and survival. Small acts of defiance were tested, carefully observed and adjusted. The swamp remained a constant threat, but also a guide, teaching those who watched its movements, studied its depths, and learned its hidden channels. The workers understood that Eveline's control, formidable though it was, had gaps, invisible, subtle, yet exploitable. They moved with caution, always aware of the delicate tension that held the plantation together. And so, the plantation existed in a state of suspended terror, a place where whispers and shadows intertwined, where fear and hope danced a delicate, dangerous dance. Eveline Duval remained the silent queen of this dark realm, her beauty and cruelty intertwined, her power extending through every corner of the estate. The workers, despite the constant threat of disappearance, began to nurture a fragile spark of defiance, knowing that the swamp, once a tool of oppression, might also hold the key to their survival. If only they could navigate its treacherous paths with courage, unity, and cunning. By the end of this year, the stage was set. The whispers had grown louder, the plans more deliberate, and the tension within the plantation had reached a point where one misstep could ignite chaos. Eveline Duval, ever vigilant, remained a formidable force, but the seeds of rebellion, nurtured in fear and careful observation, had begun to take root. The swamp, the silent accomplice, would witness the unfolding of this delicate, deadly game, a game of shadows, whispers, and survival in the heart of Louisiana's darkest waters. The Duval plantation, by now, had become something that no visitor could understand at first glance. From the outside, it remained an image of southern grandeur, white columns gleaming faintly in the hot Louisiana sun, manicured gardens perfumed with blooming jasmine and magnolia, and the gentle hum of activity that masked the horrors within. Yet beneath the surface, behind the polished floors and silken curtains, a darkness had taken root, a darkness that would not be dispelled by time, weather, or the passage of generations. Eveline Duval, the Louisiana bride, had become less a person than a force, a shadow that extended across the land, shaping every corner of the plantation with her beauty, her cruelty, and the subtle perfection of her control. The disappearances of the workers, once shocking, had become a rhythm, a horrifying cadence that the remaining staff learned to anticipate and, in a strange, twisted way, accept. Eveline's influence extended not only through fear, but through the very fabric of the land. The swamp, patient and eternal, had become a living witness, absorbing every scream, every panic-stricken glance, and every act of desperation. It was a place where hope and terror intertwined, where the lost were claimed and the survivors were molded into instruments of obedience. The people who remained had learned to navigate this delicate balance, to serve without faltering, to obey without questioning, to exist in constant awareness of the bride's eyes, whether she was present or merely imagined. Over the years, Eveline's control became more refined, more subtle, and terrifying in its perfection. She understood the power of suggestion, of psychological terror, far better than anyone else who had walked the Louisiana soil. She could inspire fear without lifting a hand, manipulate behavior without raising her voice, and command absolute obedience through the mere presence of her gaze. Workers spoke of her as though she were omnipresent, a pale, silent figure moving through the mist, her reflection glimmering in the dark waters of the swamp, her eyes observing their smallest missteps, her very presence an unspoken threat that could claim them at any moment. It was said that Eveline's fascination with the swamp never waned. She continued to wander its edges in the pre-dawn mist, sometimes for hours, standing motionless as if listening to the whispers of the water itself. Local legends began to intertwine with reality, creating stories of a bride who had made a pact with the swamp, who commanded unseen forces, and who had learned to bend the bayou to her will. Travelers passing nearby swore they heard laughter or the faintest cries, glimpsed figures moving through fog-laden reeds, or saw reflections in the water that were too pale, too elegant, and too calculating to be natural. To the local population, Eveline Duval had become a figure of fascination and horror, a woman whose legacy would endure in whispers, warnings, and the collective memory of those who lived along the bayou. Inside the plantation, the remaining workers had grown accustomed to her methods, yet they could never truly anticipate the full measure of her cruelty. Small mistakes, even those made with no malicious intent, were enough to draw her attention. Sometimes it was a sharp glance, a delicate gesture, or a fleeting comment that signaled her displeasure. At other times it was a disappearance so complete and sudden that it left no trace, no scream, no sound, only absence. These acts became part of her daily orchestration, a methodical pattern that reinforced her absolute authority. The swamp, always patient, consumed the evidence, leaving the living to tremble at its power and her control. Yet Eveline's legacy was not only one of terror, it was also a legacy of cunning, of intelligence, and of an unshakable will that shaped every aspect of the plantation. The remaining workers, despite the fear that dominated their lives, were forced to recognize her brilliance. She maintained order in a place that could have easily descended into chaos, commanded respect in a world where authority could crumble at a single misstep, and inspired a loyalty that, while born of terror, was nevertheless unwavering. In this way, Eveline Duval's power became not only a force of fear, but a carefully cultivated mastery of both people and land, entwining the swamp itself into her reign. The swamp, of course, remained central to her legend. It was a place of danger and mystery, a labyrinth of roots, water, and hidden channels that few dared traverse. The P.E. Opal who vanished into its depths were never spoken of again, yet their absence echoed in every corner of the plantation. Their loss was a reminder, a silent warning that ensured obedience. But the swamp also reflected Eveline's mind, patient, calculating, capable of concealing horrors while simultaneously revealing just enough to manipulate those who remained. It was as if the land had become her accomplice, and the very earth had learned to respond to her will. Whispers among the surviving workers began to grow, a subtle undercurrent of conversation that blended fear with speculation. They spoke in shadows, crafting coded messages through gestures and glances, always careful to avoid detection. The stories of the disappeared became both warnings and inspiration, a haunting record of Eveline's meticulous cruelty and the price of defiance. Even as fear dominated their lives, a fragile spark of resistance remained, carried in secret conversations and hidden glances. The workers understood that survival required obedience, yet their minds could not help but turn to questions. Who else would vanish next? Could Eveline be challenged? Could the swamp itself, so central to her power, be turned against her? The children of the plantation, though largely shielded from the full horrors, absorbed the atmosphere in ways that would shape them for life. They witnessed the tension, the careful movements, the hushed voices, and the silent warnings embedded in every glance. The disappearances of their caretakers and the constant surveillance of Eveline left an indelible mark, a blend of awe, fear, and an understanding that the world was far more complex and dangerous than it appeared in the sunlit gardens and elegant halls. These young observers internalized the lessons of the swamp. Obedience was survival, fear was power, and the Louisiana bride was both the heart and shadow of their reality. Eveline's influence extended beyond the plantation itself. Local towns and neighboring estates had begun to take note of the strange calm that defined the Duval property. Travelers spoke of an unnatural stillness, of people moving in silent, calculated ways, of distant cries carried across the mist. Stories of the Bayou bride spread like wildfire, blending fact with legend, each retelling amplifying her mystique and her reputation. Eveline's legacy, though terrifying, had begun to transcend the immediate confines of her land, becoming a cautionary tale and a dark fascination that reached far beyond her own influence. The years passed, and the pattern of disappearances continued. Eveline maintained her elegance, her poise, and her meticulous control over the estate, but the swamp remained a constant companion, patient and eternal. Workers continued to vanish, some returning changed, some not at all. Fear remained the dominant language, shaping behavior, thought, and interaction. Yet through it all, Eveline Duval's brilliance was undeniable. She had transformed a simple plantation into a domain of precision, obedience, and terror, where human fear was cultivated as meticulously as the gardens she adored. By the final years of her life, Eveline's legend had become inseparable from the swamp itself. The land seemed to whisper her name, and the mist hung heavy with stories of her beauty, cruelty, and intelligence. The people who remained were shadows of their former selves, forever altered by the psychological mastery she wielded. The disappeared were never forgotten, their absence a silent testament to the reach of her power. And the swamp, patient and unyielding, continued to claim and conceal, a dark mirror of the Louisiana bride's will, reflecting both her control and the enduring terror that defined her legacy. Even after Eveline Duval was gone, the plantation retained the mark of her presence. Workers and descendants spoke of the lingering cold in the hallways, of the mist rising in unnatural patterns, of shadows that seemed to move with intent. The swamp, once a living extension of her power, became a silent monument, a natural witness to the reign of the bride who had walked its edges, commanded its secrets, and transformed it into an instrument of fear. Visitors, long after her time, reported glimpses of a pale figure moving through the mist, a haunting reminder that Eveline's influence had imprinted itself upon both the land and the collective memory of the people who lived nearby. Her dark legacy was more than fear. It was a story of control, manipulation, and the enduring power of human cunning intertwined with the natural world. Eveline Duval had harnessed the swamp, the people, and her own intellect to craft an empire of terror that would be remembered for generations. The Bayou, with its twisting waters and shadowed roots, became inseparable from her legend, each ripple, each mist, each whisper a testament to the Louisiana bride, who had walked its edge and vanished as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving behind a history that was both horrifying and captivating. To this day, the Duval plantation remains a place of whispered tales, haunted by the memory of a woman who understood the delicate balance between fear and fascination. The swamp continues to hold its secrets, reflecting the chilling reality that Evelyn Duval's influence was not merely a chapter in history, but a dark legacy etched into the land itself. And as visitors walk its paths, glance into its black waters, and hear the faintest whispers in the fog, they cannot help but feel the presence of a woman whose beauty, cruelty, and command of fear have endured, ensuring that the story of the Louisiana bride, her servants, and the swamp remains alive, whispered from one generation to the next. The Duval plantation teaches a final, chilling lesson, that fear can be cultivated, controlled, and wielded with precision, and that the land itself can become both witness and accomplice to human cruelty. Evelyn Duval's story is a testament to this power, a haunting reminder that beauty and elegance can conceal unspeakable darkness, and that some legacies, once established, endure far beyond the lifetimes of those who first shaped them. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't let it end here. Comment below and tell us, which part of Evelyn Duval's terrifying reign over the Bayou unsettled you the most? Share your thoughts, your theories, or even your own stories of dark history. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because here at Sinister Truths, we dive into the darkest corners of history, revealing the secrets, the shadows, and the shocking truths that were long buried. Every story you hear brings you closer to the turning point where history's most haunting moments are finally brought into the light.